Hello and welcome. You're tuned into the best in paranormal talk radio. This is Beyond the Darkness. I'm your host, Dave Schrader. Along with me, Tim Dennis. We have a brand new Theater of the Mind coming up today, Tim.
Yes,
this is a special one. My wife has submitted a story.
Ah.
Yes, from the haunted Palmer House Hotel.
Ah.
She decided she wanted to share what she thought was one of the weirdest and most impactful paranormal experiences she's ever had. So I said, well, this would be the show to do it on today.
Okay.
So we're going to have that join us a little bit later on in the show. Right now, joining us on the phone, though, is Marc Eaton, and he is an associate professor of sociology at Ripon College in Wisconsin. He is one of the, is it co-editor? Is that the best title to give you for this book of the supernatural?
Yeah, co-editor.
Yeah, the supernatural in society, culture, and history, demonstrating the value of serious academic inquiry into supernatural beliefs and practices, from ghosts, vampirism, cryptozoology, and dark tourism to tarot cards, fortune-telling, voodoo, and alien abduction. Thank you for agreeing to join us today.
Yeah, it's a privilege. I've been a listener for quite a while, so it's an honor to be a guest.
Oh, great. Well, thank you. I appreciate that. To take a scientific approach, to take a look at all of these different aspects that, you know, it's part of the human experience, whether it's real or perceived to be real, I guess, is where the story lies. Why do you think that even in 2018, academia and science kind of turns a blind eye and scoffs at these type of topics?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the questions that both Dennis and I have been kind of grappling with, even, you know, as we attempt to, market the book and all of that is, so often the mainstream academic community kind of poo-poos this. If there's things written about it, it's typically, kind of what's wrong in these people's heads sort of stuff. So, he and I really wanted to take a serious look at this, not necessarily, again, from the side of a hardcore believer, but also not simply trying to find ways to explain away everything that people experience. As sociologists, we try to kind of go the middle road and say, well, we can't confirm or deny what people are experiencing, but these people who have these experiences absolutely believe it, and it really does truly affect how they live their lives, how they see themselves, so on and so forth. So, from a sociological perspective, we can kind of hold off the question of the absolute reality or unreality of something like an alien abduction story, and look at the experiences of the people, how that's shaped their lives. But, to get back to your question, I think that, frankly, a lot of mainstream academics are kind of afraid of the stigma associated with the supernatural, with a few exceptions. You can study things like, witchcraft in some sort of tribal culture somewhere in the world, but the second you start to step too close to so-called Western civilization and start to take this seriously is the second you start to get that kind of stench of the stigma associated with believing something that is treated as totally irrational and untrue in today's world.
Have you personally had anything that you would deem to be paranormal as an experience? Prior to studying, because I've been doing, for the past 6 years, I've been doing ethnographic research on paranormal investigators. So I've been tagging along on investigations, interviewing people, going to the conferences, that sort of thing. Prior to that, I had not had anything happen that I would have considered paranormal. I wasn't one of these people who saw things growing up as a kid or something. Since that time, I would say there's one thing that happened in particular that at least made me question my presumptions about knowing what's real in the world. And that would have happened about actually 5 years ago this week, at a place I can't name for the sake of anonymity because of the nature of the work that I do, but a place that you would probably be quite familiar with, that claims to have a lot of things happening, demonic and otherwise. And to make a long story short, essentially, while I was standing next to an investigator that I knew and trusted, she, from my perception, just flew backwards roughly 4 feet and landed on the ground, with no one near her not moving. And then a similar incident happened later that evening. And so from that point forward, it was really hard for me to take a completely agnostic stance on this, because I couldn't explain that, and it seemed to be a definitive paranormal experience. So now I'm kind of in the middle where I've never had a personal thing happen to me, like a scratch or, something, but that was something that I personally witnessed that seemed to be most easily explained through the paranormal.
When you witness something like that, and you just can't, you can't make logical sense of what occurred, and it seems to fall into that realm of the supernatural. How did that how did that infect your life going forward?
It's an interesting question, because there's both the personal piece of it, the kind of spiritual questioning component, and then there's the how to find the distance on it to write about it, which I eventually did. I've got an article out now in an academic journal called Journal of Contemporary Ethnography on that incident. And it took me a couple of years to find the distance on that event, to study it as a sociologist and not as someone who kind of had the holy crap moment, watching this unfold right before my eyes. But yeah, I mean, on a personal level, that moment certainly sticks in my mind as one that kind of forced me into a situation where I think prior to that I was unaware of how biased or arrogant perhaps I was about thinking that I knew what was going on with the supernatural, and kind of humbled me, I guess, and at least making me question things, take even more seriously what people told me in my interviews and stuff. And, I can't say that I have some sort of definitive answer on exactly what happened, but I am in a position now where I have to say there could be something going on. I don't know for certain, but, there might be more than meets the eye, I guess, literally.
And for something to exert that kind of force to actually push somebody off their feet up into the air, I mean, that tells us that there is something really at work here that goes beyond just our mind and hallucination or even mental projection, doesn't it?
And that's the interesting thing about this project, and how, as I mentioned, the kind of personal experience of being there at the moment that happened, and then trying to compartmentalize it into a kind of scholarly thing too, because, as you well know, on paranormal investigations, you have your recorder running at all times. So you've got this perfect audio record of everything that happened at the moment it happened. So because of that, I was able to go back and kind of reconstruct the moment and the whole evening and watch how the story of what, quote unquote, really happened at that moment unfolded over time. And how eventually by the end of the evening, and then a few weeks later, everybody reached the conclusion that was definitively a paranormal event. At the moment that it happened, we all were in shock. We didn't know how to process it. But pretty quickly afterwards, you had these competing stories where one person said that was definitely, some evil spirit or a man who didn't like her, running at her and throwing her to the ground. Someone else said, she just tripped. You know how it goes when you're on these investigations and you're in these moments. You've got these people both claiming that they know exactly what happened. So, on the one hand, you've got the paranormal explanation that, from my perspective at least, this is probably the one time I would say seems to explain things better than the non-paranormal explanation.
That's weird, isn't it? When you run into that unique moment when the supernatural seems to make more sense than anything else.
Right. And I mean, in the paranormal investigation community, there's a lot of adherence to a scientific approach, the Occam razor, right? That the simplest explanation is probably the correct one. And if you looked at that situation, the simplest explanation seemed to be she wasn't moving,
There was no one near her. She clearly fell backwards, a significant ways. It wasn't that she just fell in place. So what explains that, right? Well, maybe she faked it. Maybe she threw herself backwards. Maybe she, took acting lessons. Or maybe there was something that happened. What that was, I don't know. But yeah, I mean, it was one of those moments that you only need one of those. As
right.
William James said, you only need one white crow to disprove that all crows are black. So, that would be a kind of white crow moment.
Is there an importance, do you think, to the sociological aspect of who we are as humans to believe in the supernatural? Is that an important element, or is it a weakness?
Are you still there?
Yes. Can you hear us?
Yeah. I don't know what happened there.
Obviously supernatural.
Somebody didn't want you to ask the question.
Right. What I'd asked was, is there an importance to the sociological aspect of people having these experiences? Is that an important part to our humanity, or is it more of a sign of weakness, do you think?
I mean, if you look back in human history, and probably even before we have written records, belief in supernatural powers, supernatural beings, supernatural, abilities has been there before virtually anything else in human history. Really, before what you could call formalized religion, there was belief that there were spirits in, the earth, the trees, the rocks, so on and so forth. And throughout history up to maybe the 17th century or so, that kind of was predominant. And then you have the Enlightenment era where everybody says, never mind, we don't really need those things. Those are foolish, old-fashioned, weak, as you said, and that the world can be explained through science, through rationality, through collecting empirical data and looking at the results. I think the thing that's fascinating about the supernatural in today's world, paranormal investigating, but also many of the other things, cryptozoology, alien abduction stories and things like that, is this kind of blending of science and spiritual belief that, people haven't rejected the Enlightenment and this focus on science and rationality, but they've incorporated that into the belief in and search for supernatural things. So, I think that the supernatural as a belief or as a set of practices or whatever continues to persist and evolve with the times. And right now we see supernatural beliefs persisting and even actually increasing, even in the face of a very scientifically rational world, right? We rely on technology for everything, but yet just below the surface, if you ask 10 people on the street, I would say the majority of them believe in something paranormal or supernatural. So I don't think it's going away. I think it's been there since before we probably even have a record of it, and I would imagine that it's going to continue for as long as we have a human civilization. So, no, I don't see it necessarily as a sign of weakness. I think it could be something inherent in a human need to understand a world that feels so big and confusing and oftentimes scary.
You bring up the fact that here we are with the advent of all of this new technology and science, and maybe we should be straying away. You would think that we would start moving away from the superstitious and the supernatural. But yet the electronics, the type of technology that's coming out is more and more sensitive than it's ever been before. And people are starting to get strange anomalies to occur, from the Kinect's camera styles, the SLS cameras, digital audio recorders that are picking up voices that shouldn't be heard. I don't know if that's what's lending itself to it, is now the technology is starting to catch up to the ability to be more focused or more widespread, to allow itself to record these different aspects of what might be going on in the unseen world around us. Do you think that might be what's keeping this ball in motion?
I think so to a certain degree. I think if you look back 100 years ago to the spiritualist movement and the kind of early advent of parapsychology, the psychicism and things like that existed back in the late 19th century and that sort of stuff. You see people back then using the latest technologies of that era, which now, of course, look terribly old-fashioned, but using technology and using deductive reasoning and things like that to try to suss out what was really happening with ghosts or other phenomenon. Today you're absolutely right. Recording technologies, communication technologies keep getting better and better. So there could be an element, of technologies reaching a level where they're able to pick up on things that are really outside the human capacity to, take in information, like hearing and sight and things like that. The flip side of that, of course, if a skeptic was on the phone right now, they probably would argue, well, it's because, people don't really understand how to use these new technologies. That people take cameras take photos with their smartphones and things like that, and lo and behold, there's 300 orbs in it. And they don't understand, the sensitivity of, say, a digital camera versus an old 35 millimeter camera, or digital recorders. They're so sensitive they pick up things in another room that sound like they're right next to the recorder. So it's actually a misunderstanding of the technology rather than a increasing ability of the technology to capture something. So, I don't really know which way to go with that. I think there's probably a little bit of truth to both, but definitely you see the latest technologies either being incorporated into things like paranormal investigating or things like the Ovilus and stuff being created specifically for investigating. So there's very much a kind of close marriage between cutting-edge technology and the search for evidence of the paranormal.
Right. Well, and then you've got technology that acts up on its own as though it is paranormally influenced. People that have received calls from dead loved ones on their cell phones, right? The cell phone will start ringing and it's the dead loved one's phone, which has been turned off or gone, at the time of death. The famous story of the train wreck, right, that took place, and the woman's husband's phone kept ringing her, and that was able to help them pinpoint where he was in this wreckage. But there was no way he could have been calling her. The phone was far away from him, and he was dead for hours by the time they got to him. And we also have people that have received strange text messages and emails and documents in their computer that seem to be random bits of typing. And then if you look at it, you'll actually see that there's messages within it. And it's not just the pareidolia type messages, but it's like something's pushing through trying to communicate and type these messages out. So that aspect of the new technology and how sensitive it may be to subtle influence. And, whereas before you used to have to pick up a pen or a quill or a crayon to write on something, now it can be a gentle caress of a keyboard that may be able to convey these messages from beyond if they're truly taking place. So it's interesting to me, but I guess, also at the point it can be easily dismissed as nothing more than, remnant issues with the keyboard or whatever else has gone on. Do you see a point at all with science and culture just coming to an understanding that the supernatural exists or coexists with us at all times? Or do you think there'll always be that break between rationale and, the belief in things that seem to defy ration?
Yeah, I mean, that's the $10 million question, right? Is will this ever reach a point where there's a kind of mainstream legitimacy as well as everything that comes along with that, like funding and so on? I guess I would like to say that there might reach a point where at least some aspects of what we now call supernatural or paranormal, could be given more legitimacy, but I don't know if that's just, fantastical thinking, because if you look at parapsychology, for example, in the Journal of Parapsychology and other things like that, it's, if you read the articles and things, they're extremely thorough in their methods, to the point of being kind of overdoing it sometimes, I think in terms of all the checks and balances that they provide. But they've been doing that now for a long time, for a couple of generations. And yet, in terms of getting a foot in the door in mainstream institutions, colleges and universities, getting funding, getting people to take them seriously. I don't know if I'm being honest how much headway they've made in that regard. So if you look at them as a test case, parapsychology or things like psi, that sort of stuff, I don't know if there's a lot of reason to have hope that in the next generation, things like cryptozoology, ghosts, things like that will be taken more seriously. Nonetheless, I think that the hope that that's going to be happening is one of the things that I've seen at least driving a lot of paranormal investigators, is this sense of being on the pioneering edge of some sort of scientific discovery. And if we can just find that one golden piece of evidence to prove it to everybody, then finally it'll be taken seriously. At which point, ironically, it would no longer be called paranormal or supernatural, right? It would be integrated into the natural world.
Nah, we're going to keep it in the paranormal. We found it. We proved it. We get to keep it in weird.
I've been at both paranormal conferences and academic conferences, and I can tell you that the paranormal ones are more fun. So,
of course they are. Very, very fun. All right, we're back, Professor. Thank you for your patience and time on this. The book, again, is The Supernatural in Society, Culture, and History. You've got a lot of great people that have invested time and effort into this book. You've got many different topics, everything from alien abduction, cryptozoology, vampirism, voodoo, black culture, cultural geographies, all of this great topics. How did you decide what you wanted to include in this book?
Yeah, I mean, it was difficult, and ultimately, as we acknowledge in the introduction, we couldn't include everything, So, but we wanted to include, I guess, both a wide variety of topics and a wide variety of people coming from different perspectives in the larger academic community. So, both Dennis and I, my co-editor, we've both been studying ghosts. He studies people who live or work in reportedly haunted locations, as well as some other stuff regarding, haunted cemeteries, that sort of thing. He has a book that came out a couple of years ago called Ghostly Encounters. So, he comes at it from the ghost perspective. I come at it from the ghosts by way of paranormal investigation. We do have a couple other chapters that touch upon things like ghost lore in Nova Scotia, and then ghost tourism, the kind of commodification of things like haunted bed and breakfasts, ghost walks, that sort of stuff. So those cover the ghost aspect pretty well. But then we also wanted to go beyond that and look at things like, for example, fortune-telling, tarot, that sort of stuff, because, there are practices that I guess, particularly fortune-telling, kind of works on the fringes of the mainstream economy. You can find people at fairs or, little stands or storefronts downtown where you can get your fortune told for a small fee. So that chapter really talks a lot about fortune-telling as this kind of commodified way of people getting some sense of predictability and control in the world, particularly in the context of, today's culture where the global economy, global politics, that sort of stuff is all kind of creating this constant sense of stress and instability. And that chapter also, just kind of as a plug, has some really cool pictures of a Donald Trump fortune-telling machine. So I encourage people to look at that. But,
okay.
But yeah, and so, we wanted to look at things like tarot, fortune-telling, that sort of thing, because those are ways that people help put some predictability, control, making choices in their lives, getting through difficult times in their lives through things like divorces, that sort of stuff. But, especially as sociologists, we're also sensitive to race, class, and gender issues as they relate to anything. So, the chapter by Janet Baldwin, for example, on tarot, looks specifically at a small group of women and how they form a community through tarot reading, and how they're basically there for each other through good and bad in this community of tarot readers. The one that you mentioned with voodoo, that looks at the history of voodoo in New Orleans, which is a fascinating history, and looks at it specifically as a black cultural practice and a kind of quasi-religious practice that grew in the New Orleans area because of historical reasons of migration and stuff. But also how that's been turned into a tourist object by the leaders of New Orleans, both black and white community leaders, so that you can go down there and you can have a quote-unquote real voodoo experience if you want to. But then there's just so much other stuff out there. There's TV shows galore about the supernatural. So we couldn't do everything, but we did want to make sure that we touched upon some things like vampires, for example, which I think, it's a particularly interesting chapter with these people who not only, talk about being vampires, but really engage in the practices of vampires, like sucking blood or energy in the case of psychic vampires. So, in the nature of doing a book that wasn't going to be 600 pages long, we had to decide what to include and what to exclude, at least on this first go-round. But I think we did a pretty good job of hitting at least some of the major things like aliens, cryptozoology, ghosts, and then other stuff like vampires and fortune-telling and stuff that are maybe not as commonly examined in these sorts of books.
Was there anything that you found from the contributors that was surprising to you?
Some of the topics I didn't know a lot about, frankly. So that's been another great thing about putting together this book is that, I'm no expert on voodoo in New Orleans, for example. So, I think one of the things that I found surprising was some of the similarities across different types of supernatural beliefs and practices. So, if you read through the book from beginning to end, you're going to go through a kind of laundry list of supernatural beliefs, supernatural practices. But what you'll find at the end is that there's certain common themes, for example, all of these things by nature of being called supernatural or paranormal are marginalized beliefs, things that mainstream science says aren't real, things that mainstream religion says either is not real or is of the devil, right?
Right.
So no matter which one of those two you go to, they're going to tell you don't bother with that. But yet you see with tarot, with fortune telling, with ghost hunting, with, real vampires, cryptozoology, right on down the line, that doesn't dissuade millions of people from spending their time, spending their money, engaging in these things. And so that's one thing I found consistently across it, which I guess was surprising how strong of a theme that was. The other thing I guess I found was just how often spiritual beliefs and practices are used by people to give the world some sense of order and meaning. What does this all mean? I think is the perpetual question. So, some people get that through going to church on Sunday. Some people do that by practicing voodoo or looking for Bigfoot or, attending paranormal conferences and learning about people's EVPs. So that's been the interesting journey.
I want to touch on a few as we kind of look at the table of contents of your book, toward a crypto science, really kind of examining the idea of these creatures. Why is this still such a foreign deal and people so willing to roll eyes when we are finding hundreds and sometimes thousands of species every year? It seems like we should be beyond the idea of laughing or denying cryptozoology.
Yeah, and in fact, one of the chapters, the cryptozoology chapter by T. Krulos, he looks at, for example, the coelacanth, which is a well-known example of a living fossil, something that was believed to be extinct millions of years ago, and then lo and behold, winds up in someone's fishing net in the 30s, I believe, initially. And so that becomes the kind of mascot of cryptozoology, that, see, we told you so. There are things out there that people believe don't exist or don't exist anymore that are just lurking in the depths of the ocean in that case. So, the question of why, in the face of so many people going out and finding things that, at least within the paranormal community are taken to be definitive proof of ghosts, of cryptids, fill in the blank. I think it gets back again to what we were talking about earlier, the stigma associated with these sorts of things, that if I, as Joe Scientist, come out and openly proclaim that I am taking seriously anyone who is a Bigfoot hunter or something like that, I'm now threatening my very
career, right?
Right.
I'm threatening the money that I make at the institution. I'm threatening any chance that my research is going to get funding through some sort of national grant foundation. I'm going to be the person who people whisper about when I go to conferences in the future. And I've even experienced some of that, as a sociologist, which we tend to be perceived by the quote unquote hard scientists as a bit fluffy anyway. So, but people walking across campus asking me like, oh, you seen any ghosts recently? So, I think there's just a real threat to the sense that maybe mainstream science doesn't know everything. And it only shifts when there's overwhelming evidence, as well as people in positions of power that stand by that evidence. Right now, you could say, at least from the perspective of paranormal enthusiasts and investigators, there might be evidence of X, Y, or Z in terms of cryptids or whatnot, but there aren't people in positions of power in mainstream systems of religion and science that will stand by that evidence and say, actually, this isn't crap. This is something real we need to take seriously. So unless or until that happens, I think you're just going to have people at paranormal conferences believing in one version of the truth and people at biology or physics conferences believing in a different version of the truth. And I am not as much of a fortune teller, I guess, to see how those two things can come together, at least in the near future.
What a shame. It seems like there would be a natural compliance between them, right? That, you kind of have to have one to have the other. And many of the things that we have now and many of the sciences that we've created came from the black magic and the idea that these couldn't possibly exist. And yet, because we kept, we were diligent about examining it and experiencing it, we found answers to these questions. I mean, could you imagine what it must have been like for somebody to believe, yeah, right, I'm going to hold a box in my hand and punch some numbers, and then somebody on the other side of the world's box is going to ring, and there's going to be invisible waves that are going to send my voice to their voice. You'd sound like a charlatan, right? You'd probably be burned at the stake for even talking about such witchcraft. But here it is. It exists all around us. There's technology that was born of someone thinking beyond what science had already accepted as possible. So it seems stifling to me that there's still this weird hold off from a lot of mainstream science from looking into these aspects and how they may tie into the whole human element and make our experiences here for health, psychology, neurology, all of that, maybe more understandable.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of the weird irony right now is that communication technologies, especially things like smartphones and stuff, are so advanced that they have a kind of supernatural quality to them almost. I mean, you can just, at this point now, you can just speak in your living room and some computer somewhere will listen to your voice, interpret what you mean, and then tell you the answer, which in some ways doesn't seem that far afield from, say, what the Fox sisters were doing back in the mid-19th century with knocks and raps and things like that, or other spiritualists of that era, right? So, yeah, on the one hand, the latest technologies really are unexplainable by the vast majority of people who use them. There's a few people out there who really understand how smartphones work, but most of us just use them and find their ability to give us any information we want kind of supernatural in some sense, right? It's incredible what you can find. But yeah, you're right that still, at least as of now, mainstream scientific communities, and also I think it's important to point out the mainstream religious communities too, still shy away from anything that has the air of paranormal or supernatural about it, unless they can incorporate it into their way of seeing the world. So, for example, angels in a Christian tradition are not seen as something irrational to believe in, right? Many people believe in angels, and they're not seen as kooky. But, you start talking about, say, ghosts that are in someone's house or something like that, or, shadow people or something, and now you're in the realm of the kooky. So I think the thing that Dennis and I articulate in the
in the introduction to this book is that, what defines something as supernatural isn't something inherent in that thing. It's how that thing has been marginalized by both mainstream science and mainstream religion. And we have this kind of third category of the supernatural that becomes a catch-all for all the stuff that's been sloughed off by science and religion over the years. And that's the part that we're really interested in, is why does that stuff persist? Why do people still believe in it when we have church and we have, Scientific American to explain to us different ways of seeing the world? But the supernatural persists and probably will for the foreseeable future.
I know one of the chapters is Paranormal Investigation, the Scientist and the Sensitive. And I would like to talk about that specifically, as I see your name attached to that segment of the book as it is. I want to talk about that when we come back. Right now, though, it's time to go to our Darchives. We've got an actual story, a paranormal encounter from my wife at an event, Tim, at the Palmer House Hotel. And her first encounter there, her first real paranormal experiences. And she was so excited to share this with me and has been reticent to even offer. But she said, you know what, if you ever would like my story. And I said, yeah, I'd love your story. So ladies and gentlemen, it's time now to turn down the lights, get close to the radio, and tune in for this week's Theater of the Mind.
Shook to the Core. My Unexpected Paranormal Encounter by Winifred Schrader. I had always been fascinated by the paranormal, even at a very young age. I had bizarre experiences when I was little, but they were never scary. I could always sense things in my surroundings, but never understood thoughts and feelings I would have, knowing they were not my own. Later in life, I would learn that I'm an empath, thanks to Dave Schrader and Tim Dennis covering the topic on Darkness Radio. I had a good grasp of being an empath and wanted to put it to the test. That fall, Darkness Radio was holding an event at the Palmer House in Sauk Center, Minnesota. I called up my sister and said, let's do this. We both were excited for a nice little weekend getaway and have quality sister time together. This was our first paranormal event and our first time officially ghost hunting with equipment and expert guidance. We were ready to soak up this experience, not knowing what to expect. We arrived at the Palmer House and entered the lobby. We were blown away on how surreal everything looked. It was like we were stepping back in time to the early 1900s. They try and keep the hotel as authentic as possible, and they do a great job of it. We settled in our rooms, went downstairs to the bar, ate, drank with fellow Darkness Radio listeners, and had a good old time. The next day, we sat in on the talks to try and learn everything possible. They were holding a psychomantium experiment in the basement as well. It sounded so intriguing, I just had to sign up for it. Dave escorted me downstairs to the door room where the experiment took place. This was a little platform to stand on and a mirror on the wall. Dave explained to me what to do. Just stand here, find a fixed point to focus on, and relax your mind and body. He turned off the light, shut the door, and I stood in the silence where it was dark, with just the low light of the candle illuminating my face below. My face began to distort as if I was aging right before my eyes. Unnerving and yet fascinating all at the same time. I wanted more. All of a sudden, my shoulder and neck began to tingle as if energy was being pumped into the left side of my body. I felt a presence, not evil or anything, but it was mischievous and up to no good. The tingling sensation grew stronger on my left side as if it was right next to mine, yet I could see nothing. I could feel it lean in as if someone was about to whisper something in my ear. In a very breathy voice, a man whispered,
"You go, girl,"
in my ear. My eyes popped open to the size of dinner plates. I was expecting to hear the usual, "Get out," or "Help me." With a baffled look on my face, I chuckled to myself. Well, you don't hear that every day in the paranormal. My experience was over, and I headed back upstairs. My sister asked me, what happened? Were you scared? I'll tell you all about it over a drink. After what happened, I couldn't wait to ghost hunt that night. I was ready. Well, so I thought. It was 10 p.m. and we all gathered in the main room for the ghost hunt. We all split up into 3 groups so we could rotate floors and get the best experience possible. I was itching to investigate room 17, Lucy's room. Lucy was known to be a woman of the night who resides in room 17. She is known not to like men in particular, but for good reason. It was our turn to investigate the 3rd floor. We grabbed the tools and equipment we wanted to try. I picked up the SLS camera and couldn't wait. We entered the room and I was immediately drawn to the bathroom area. My sister followed along with a few others. I scanned the bathroom area with the SLS camera in hopes that my gut was right, and boy, was it ever. Standing right in the bathroom, the SLS camera detected an anomaly. Knowing what I've learned, I wanted to make sure whatever it was detecting was legit and not picking up on a fixed object. So we asked Lucy to raise her left hand. She did. We asked her to raise her right hand. She did. I was completely blown away. All of a sudden, another figure popped right behind her. The room energy immediately changed to a negative vibe. Next thing we saw was unsettling and unnerving, to say the least. Two figures began to intertwine at first. Then, right before our eyes, we could see one figure look as though he was reaching out and choking the other one, believed to be Lucy. "Oh my God, he's choking her!" I yelled. I felt a protective instinct towards Lucy. "Get off her now!" I screamed in the empty bathroom as I stomped towards it. "You get your hands off her!" Once I said that, they disappeared. What the hell did I just witness? Was this a time slip? Or a loop in time that Lucy experienced in the past? We all just stared at each other in disbelief and tried to collect ourselves. The next thing we heard, it was time to switch and head down to the second floor. My sister and I were relieved since our room was on the second floor and we needed a break. I told her I would meet her there, and she headed down first. I returned the equipment and headed down myself. As I approached our room, I stopped cold in my tracks. The air was heavy and full of energy. Then all of a sudden, a heavy, wet blanket of emotions hit me out of nowhere. So much so, I fell back into the wall in the hallway. I didn't understand. Why was I so terrified for my life, scared and upset? This wasn't my feelings. It was as if I was outside looking in on someone. Could this be Lucy? I pushed myself off the wall and ran into our room. My sister was on the bed and I zoomed past her to our bathroom. I covered my mouth to try and hold in all the agony and pain I wanted out, but my efforts failed. I bursted into tears and began to wail out loud. My sister ran to me, brought me over to the bed. I was on the verge of a full-blown panic attack and I was terrified. My sister asked me, "What's wrong? What happened?" And all I could say was, "I don't know. I don't know why I'm feeling this way." And I just could not stop crying. Eventually, I calmed down, and then I kind of realized what was happening to me. Lucy impressed her fears and emotions onto me, as if she was trying to communicate with me. My sister and I got up the very next morning. After what happened the previous night, I have collected myself and my thoughts and had a better understanding of what was happening. We decided to go down to the basement and have one more sweep to see if we can have any more activity. I wanted to go back into the door room where we had the psychomantium experiment to see if I could have one more last experience. I stood there in the dark all by myself like I did the previous day. You could hear footsteps shuffling on dirty concrete. It was coming closer and closer to me. I was a little bit scared. The vibe in the room was a lot different than the previous day. It was very light and loving. And I wasn't terrified, I just didn't know what to expect. Next thing I knew, I could feel tingling on the back of my neck. All of a sudden, I could feel a hand cradling the back of my head, as if you were a mother holding a newborn child's head. It was as if someone was trying to tell me, "Thank you. Thank you for sticking up for me. Thank you for being there for me." And then the feeling just dissipated on the back of my head. I stood there for a minute, and next thing I knew, to the right of me, I could see a shadow person walk from the doorway to the corner of the room, as if they were just saying goodbye. After the weekend was over, my sister and I packed up our things and headed back home. We talked about all the experiences we had, whether we were together or apart, and all the great people that we met at the event. I learned a lot about myself that weekend, what my limitations are, what my weaknesses are, and what my strengths are. So if you're about to go on a ghost hunt, whether you're a seasoned investigator or a rookie like I was, just always be prepared for the good, the bad, and the unexpected.
Beyond the darkness.
Hello, welcome back to the show. This is Beyond the Darkness, your home for the best in paranormal talk radio every Saturday and Sunday. And I have something going on I'd like you guys to give us a hand with. You know that we've always helped Second Harvest Heartland, trying to help our friends, neighbors, co-workers, and fellow Americans right here in our own backyard that are in need of help. So what I'm doing with the show Midnight in the Desert, anybody that subscribes this month in the month of July for your first time, if you subscribe, it's $4.99 a month. We're going to donate $4 of that in the month of July to Second Harvest Heartland. We're going to cut them a check at the beginning of August. And we've already got over 100 new subscribers. We'd love for you to subscribe and hear the best in anomalous talk radio. I'm on Midnight in the Desert Monday through Friday, 9 p.m. to midnight Pacific time. That is 11 p.m. till 2 a.m. Central Time. And for those of you on the East Coast, it is midnight till 3 a.m. in the morning. And yeah, maybe you can't listen live and you can't stay up for that, but you want to catch all the great topics and conversations we have. Well, you can subscribe. Go to midnightinthedesert.com/hunger. That's midnightinthedesert.com/hunger. And if you subscribe in the month of July, your $4 of your $4.99 subscription price is going to be donated right to Second Harvest Heartland. And every $1 we raise helps supplies 3 square meals to somebody in need. So that's amazing. With already 100 people that have done this, Tim.
Wow.
Right. We've been able to supply, over 400 meals, more than that. But it's a crazy amount of meals that we're able to help supply to people in need within our communities. So please help us out. Plus, you get the best of all worlds. You get to listen to Midnight in the Desert Monday through Friday, and then join us here on Beyond the Darkness every Saturday and Sunday. So if you're going to subscribe to Midnight in the Desert, go check it out at midnightinthedesert.com/hunger and help us put an end to hunger right here in our country. Our guest this evening, as we have one more segment to go with him, Marc Eaton, Professor Marc Eaton. One of the chapters that you did was paranormal investigation, the scientist and the sensitive. I'd love for your insight on that. Talk to me a little bit, if you would, about investigations and looking at everything that you saw under a scientific protocol and how it all works.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I found pretty early on when I started doing the research is, tagging along on paranormal investigations. I guess from an outsider's perspective coming in, I assumed I'd see a pretty even combination of what I'm calling scientific and sensitive approaches. So scientific would be the more technologically heavy approach that is looking for documented evidence of something going on in a location. And then the other component of that is the debunking, right? So you can also use the technology to prove that, in fact, it was nothing happening paranormal. It was something going on that can be explained through EMF or uneven flooring or something like that. And then the sensitive approach, which is kind of a catch-all term for people who identify as empaths, mediums, psychics, that sort of thing, where it's not so much about relying upon the gadgets, but it is more about coming in and feeling things, using your quote-unquote third eye, that sort of stuff, to see what's happening in this setting, perhaps make some connection with the spirits that are there. So that I kind of expected to see about a 50-50 split. What I found was that pretty overwhelmingly, the scientific approach seems to dominate the subculture. So on investigation teams that I tagged along with, most of them relied upon technology. Most of them on their websites and other things proclaim themselves to be scientifically oriented, to use debunking and all of that, which doesn't necessarily mean that there aren't sensitives on those teams, but that as a team, the overarching approach is a scientific approach, and that sensitives oftentimes play a secondary role on those teams. So, in terms of how the investigation happens, how these things are different, the scientific approach, as I'm sure many people who are listening are familiar, you go in with recorders, all sorts of things that collect environmental data. The list goes on in terms of all the stuff that people use to either collect evidence that proves that there's something paranormal happening, or collect evidence that you can use to disprove the paranormal, at least in that situation, and tell the homeowner that they don't have anything happening, they just need to get their electrical box fixed. And then the sensitive approach, people go in sometimes cold, knowing nothing about the setting, walk it, try to pick up on spirits that are present, and in some cases guide the use of scientific equipment by saying, for example, put a camera there. But more often than not, what I've found is that sensitives during investigations might make some kind of tentative claims about what's happening in a situation, but then rely upon the so-called scientific team to confirm or deny their hunches. So there's kind of a power hierarchy, you could say, both on paranormal teams and within the subculture as a whole, where the gadget-heavy, scientifically oriented debunking approach is dominant, and the sensitives tend to either couch their claims in scientific terms by saying, I felt that something was going on in the setting, I could feel the presence of an old man, and then later on when we checked our recorders, there was an EVP of this old man's voice. So they use the scientific to prove the sensitive, or they kind of hedge a little bit and say, just take this with a grain of salt, but I feel like there's an old man in the corner right now staring at us. So that's the dynamic that I picked up on in the subculture as a whole and the teams I observed. So that's the chapter that I wrote, is talking about that power dynamic between scientific and sensitive approaches in the paranormal investigation subculture.
Did you find that it was pretty well balanced, or did you see that, the protocols in place were really not very elegant or adhered to?
Protocols in place in terms of how to go about investigating?
Yeah, especially in utilizing somebody that's a sensitive.
Yeah, I think it depends to a large degree on who the leader of the team is. If the leader of a team is someone who largely disavows anything that's sensitive-oriented, in other words, they say, I don't really buy a lot of the psychic stuff, our team is going to just use technology, then anyone on that team who does feel like they have some sort of ability to sense spirits is perpetually going to be playing the underdog role on that team. And so, what I found with both observing teams, and then I did 46 interviews with investigators around the country, that they tended to just play the secondary role, right? They just sort of let the scientific thing happen, and then sometimes bite their tongue if they're feeling something because they're worried that their team members are going to think they're nuts. Or they might say something, but they'll hedge. They'll say, I don't know if this is anything, but right now the hair on the back of my neck is standing up, and it seems like there's someone standing behind me. Could you take a picture? On the other hand, if you have teams that have people leading them, they're at least open to the idea of, sensitives being a real thing. There's more respect for sensitives on the team. They're not treated as second-class citizens so much. But because those teams exist in a larger subculture that's so dominated by the scientific approach, those teams still say, look, we all believe in sensitives, we all think that's great. However, at the end of the day, if we want to prove this to the client, if we want to prove this to other people in the paranormal community, and especially if we want to prove it to the mainstream scientific community, stories about what you're feeling aren't going to cut it. We need to have the hard data. So in both cases, it seems like it wraps back around to putting a lot more emphasis on the voice recordings, the video, in some cases photography and other things.
You had a chance to do something and look at it from a different light, as opposed to just, like many of us that want to go on an investigation and we're a part of it. You went as an observer, right? And to be active in it, but to be more as an observer and watch. Do you think that, the way people investigate is really doing our field any service at all in trying to prove or disprove the existence of the supernatural?
That's a really interesting question. I think, again, there's so much variability. One of the things that's difficult in a field that isn't quite as systematized as, say, something like physics or biology is that there's a lot of right ways to do it, a lot of wrong ways to do it too. But, if you look at a dozen different teams, there's going to be a kind of core of methods for investigating, but there's also going to be a whole lot of flexibility. So part of what I've seen too is this kind of constant battle within the paranormal investigation field or community about what constitutes the right way to do it. So, some people will say, forget the sensitives, it's all about the gadgets. Other people will say, those gadgets are just getting in your way. You really just need to go in and feel it, open yourself up to it, right? And both of those people are absolutely sure that they're right. So, in terms of the larger question of legitimacy and finding the right way to do things, it's a tricky question to answer because there's just so much variability in the field. But, I think that there has been a concerted effort by paranormal investigators to do their best to control the things they can control in a setting, try to do investigations in the evening when it's quieter, try to keep people out of the house, try to look for rational explanations first. That's one of the things I've found consistently. I think people who don't know much about paranormal investigation probably presume people go in and the first time they hear a bump, they scream demon.
Right.
And they have all of their superstitions confirmed, and then they're happy and they leave. That's not how it works. Mostly these teams go about systematically trying to disprove what's going on in a setting, and then if there's anything left at the end, they might say, that could be something. But very rarely does anybody just jump to a conclusion and say, well, that's a ghost. So there is a real effort consistently across teams I investigated and people I interviewed to do their best to make it scientific. But because it doesn't really have any formal rules for how to do it, and because a lot of the teams don't communicate with one another, and because there isn't some sort of international repository of paranormal evidence where all these teams are dropping their stuff in, it's really hard because people keep kind of reinventing the wheel again and again, or putting their twist on what they saw in Ghost Hunters, for example.
Right, and using what they've learned on TV as the formula. Although what I've tried to tell people is, listen, what you're seeing on TV is so truncated from what they actually have to do. So to build the protocol on what you've seen them do in an 8-second setup is, I think, doing a lot of people a disservice because you don't realize what really goes into all of the pre-investigation and all of the setup and the tech and everything that goes into it. So, and boy, isn't it surprising? You watch TV, it is electric to see what's going on there. You sit in on an actual investigation, and it can be worse than watching grass grow. It takes so long for something to happen, and you don't even know that anything happened until you go back and review the evidence.
Yeah, and that's not to include all the time for evidence review as well, which is
right.
One of the things I heard from team members is, the quickest way to weed people out is to make them review 8 to 12 hours of a camera that was facing a wall, right? So yeah, I mean, the people who are involved in this and who really do it for years and years are truly committed. This isn't some sort of thrill-seeking thing. I found that as well. You have those people, but they come in quickly and they leave quickly, right? Because they watched Ghost Adventures, they want to get scratched, and then they realize that they're going to be sitting in a dark room trying to be as quiet as possible and not fall asleep at 2 o'clock in the morning. So, it isn't what you see on TV, but the people that I've interviewed and talked to talk a lot about TV as being this kind of double-edged sword, right? Where on the one hand, it brings in the thrill seekers, it brings in the people who want the quick fix, and then they burn out, they get bored, they leave. But on the other hand, it has this kind of legitimizing and destigmatizing effect for the for the subculture and for the practice of paranormal investigating, where especially things like Ghost Hunters come on, and really, I guess, maybe not for the very first time, but at least in recent TV memory, they show people going about this systematically and kind of soberly using debunking and trying to present paranormal investigation as something that's actually a legitimate practice, not something that's just people, doing legend tripping to the local cemetery. So, people I've interviewed talk about it as being a good thing for paranormal investigation and that it's mainstreamed it to some degree, and it's allowed them to quote unquote come out of the closet about being an investigator, being a psychic. But it also has this downside of bringing people in that are more interested in the spooky than they are in the scientific.
Yeah, I'm hoping, I keep hoping that protocol will find a way and bring people together to do this and start to actually corroborate each other's evidence or help each other understand what common mistakes and flaws we make. But I that seems to be a pretty far stretch too in hoping that unity is going to take place. It's a weird field, right? Because it's something that everybody has this common interest in, but nobody can agree upon.
Absolutely, and especially along the lines of the scientific versus sensitive. That's like a fault line kind of that runs through the paranormal investigation community is, what do you think about psychics? You ask that question and you're going to get people on pretty far ends of the spectrum on that. And it's to some degree an irreconcilable difference. Someone who grew up from age 3 seeing things, hearing things, it can go into reportedly haunted locations and give pretty accurate, examples of who's haunting what room, will definitely punch back if someone tells them that they're a liar. On the other hand, you have people who are completely in the camp that psychics are just seeking attention and that's about it. And they're not going to be convinced either. So that's a critical fault line in the community. And then there's just a lot of other interpersonal drama and stuff that happens, but that's kind of true for any group of people.
We're back and talking with our guest. I know time's getting away from us, Professor Eaton. I want to chat a little bit more about the really kind of the impact of the supernatural on the human element. And we kind of touched on it in the first segment a little bit, but it seems important. Like we need something to believe in, something fantastical. And maybe that's why science fiction and fairy tales have always been such an important part of our lives as well. It's nice to challenge your brain and take it outside of the mundane. And to have beliefs in these things, do you think that are there times that it's unhealthy to be focused on this aspect of our world and our reality? Or is it always really good to keep questioning, keep pushing, and examine things beyond what people consider normal?
I mean, I think certainly at the individual level, you can have people that have an unhealthy, attachment to any given thing, right? So, in the same way that someone might get unhealthily absorbed by something like alien abduction stories or, find themselves out in the woods every single weekend to the extent that they lose their job because they keep hunting for Bigfoot. Yeah, I mean, there can be an unhealthy level of attachment to supernatural beliefs, supernatural practices, that sort of thing. I don't think that necessarily is any different from, say, someone who can go a little too far in their, religious beliefs or a little too far in other aspects of their lives. So, yeah, at the individual level, sure, it can be unhealthy. At the cultural level, the historical level, mostly what I found in my research and what these chapters show is that, on balance, belief in the supernatural, stories about it, finding community with other people who believe in similar things, tends to be something that I'd say more often than not is kind of a harmless thing, right? So even if at the end of the day we find out that none of the stuff that is in this book actually exists, right? Has that really had a net benefit or a net drawback on society and culture? I would probably argue, at least as a sociologist, that it's probably had a benefit in the sense that it's still bringing people together. It's still providing people a sense of meaning in the world. In many cases, like, for example, the chapter about real vampires, it's really central to someone's identity. They find a lot of personal meaning in that identity. So on balance, I would say that it's not necessarily something that's unhealthy, for society as a whole, any more than a belief in anything else, right? I think you would probably have a lot of people pushing back if you argued that something like mainstream religion was unhealthy. because it's been kind of legitimized and people believe it and don't question it. But something like the supernatural that's still on the fringes, people see that as something that's potentially unhealthy. But personally, I don't see a real difference between people who go ghost hunting on a Saturday night and people who go to church on a Sunday morning.
All right. I guess that's a great point, right? It's having a belief system, unless it's endangering others, is not a bad thing, right? And keeping... I've found that it's really been fascinating for me, especially because it gives me an interesting connection to my children and my parents, aunts and uncles, friends. It's something that seems to kind of interest everybody, even the people that will staunchly deny that it takes place. They're fascinated by the stories. And I think in many cases, they're more fascinated by the way we react to those stories and the way that people react. And I think that's what makes the supernatural, the paranormal, and these ideas so appealing on such a wide scale, because we do have that childlike part of us that wants to believe in the strange. And, I know there's a whole chapter on the allure of dark tourism, right? Legend tripping, ghost seeking in dark places. Rachel Ironside writes on that. But man, it's, I challenge people all the time. Tim and I do live events around the United States and around the world. Instead of just living vicariously by sitting on your couch and watching these TV programs, instead of just listening on the radio or through your car or your headphones on a walk about everybody else's experience, this is one of those kind of things that there is a story in every town, in every block, right? And to actually get yourself involved in that part of the history is not so hard. It's one of the easiest hobbies or interests to actually look into. And it doesn't have to cost you a lot of money. And if you want to meet people like Tim and I or, other speakers from the paranormal television programming and such, there's events around the world that you can actually go to. And you're going to meet like-minded people that have the same interests and open-mindedness and are willing to examine and look at these concepts. And I think that's really kind of an interesting aspect. There's a place for all of us misfit toys, right? there's a community.
You definitely touch upon a couple important things there. I mean, at least for the paranormal investigators, which is what I'm most familiar with, they say regardless of whether we listen to our audio, watch our video, and come up dry on this, wasn't it cool that we got to be in X location for 6 hours? Wasn't it cool that we could just kind of stumble around Waverly or, be in this, historical museum that people rarely get access to these certain portions of, and so a lot of people in paranormal investigation are also deeply interested in history, and especially the history of their local communities, like you said, and every little small town has stories. Ripon, where I live, is a very small town, but as soon as people found out that I was doing this research, of course, people start asking me about, oh, did you know that this place is haunted and that place is haunted? So, you could live in a town of 2 people and there'd probably still be a ghost story. So I think that that's an important piece of it is finding these historical locations, in some cases, keeping those places alive by virtue of doing ghost tours and stuff like that. And then the other piece, as you mentioned, is the community. I've attended quite a few of the paranormal conferences. And as you said, it's a group of open-minded people. It's nice to be in a location in this day and age where you can meet people that are not judgmental and, tend to just treat each other with respect, and are open to different ways of looking at the world. So, even though in my particular chapter I talk about this kind of scientific versus sensitive divide, in reality, there's a whole lot of coexistence in the paranormal community too, where, people respect other people's interests or perspectives, even if they don't personally 100% agree with that. So, getting back to my previous answer, I think if you can find places in the world where you can spend time with people that are open-minded, supportive, and find a sense of belonging in that, I don't really see the harm in that.
Is there any aspect of the supernatural that unnerves you that, you want to keep your distance from?
It's an interesting question. Growing up, of course, I was a child of the 80s, so I watched a lot of Unsolved Mysteries and things like that. and so the thing that I guess always terrified me the most was the alien question. So, if I had decided to study that, would I have freaked out more often or not? I'm not sure, but that's out of these things that are in the paranormal or supernatural realm. The alien component has always been spookier to me, I guess, than the ghost piece. But, I think that any aspect of this could be terrifying if you had the right experience. I happen to have picked paranormal investigation and had that experience that I talked about earlier with the person apparently being thrown backwards, within a foot of me. So that was pretty terrifying. But, had I picked Bigfoot and seen some big hairy ape, walking through the woods, I probably would have had a similar experience. So, I don't think there's anything that I would say is inherently off limits in terms of any future research that I do on supernatural beliefs and practices. But just as the sort of kid in me gets a little bit creeped out by the gray aliens.
What do you? How do you weigh in on things like EVP, electronic voice phenomena?
Yeah, I mean, in the process of doing this research, of course, I've participated in all these investigations, which mean I have my own video recorder, I have my own audio recorder, and to be a good investigator meant also to review all my data and send clips to the team leaders in case, I found something that seemed kind of odd. And there were times, where I would listen through and I'd hear someone humming a tune, or I'd hear what sounded like someone saying a word or maybe even a whole sentence. I don't know what those were. It could be, again, just pareidolia where, I'm listening for 5 hours, so my brain is just going to kind of keep me entertained by finding something where there isn't something. On the other hand, I've listened to those clips multiple times and hear the same thing. So I don't know if it is something that exists. First of all, I don't know how it happens, especially on digital recorders where there isn't any magnetic tape to actually imprint anything on. If it's happening, then the question is, well, what is that voice? Is that actually a voice from the other side? Is that a voice from the Wendy's drive-thru? What is it exactly that's actually being captured on my audio recorder? So, it's kind of cool on a personal level to imagine that that's some way that people who are on the other side can communicate with us. But I don't know enough about the science of it to say definitively how that would be possible. How someone from say a parallel dimension or something could somehow throw their voice across the dimension onto a digital recorder at command. I don't know how that would work. So, I have found things that seem kind of strange, but I can't say definitively that that's proof of anything.
The book is out and available through Temple University Press. We'll have a link up to that on today's posting. Marc, thank you so much for stopping in and giving us a little insight and background on the studies and the supernatural and society, culture, and history. It's been a pleasure chatting with you.
Yeah, likewise. Pleasure for me as well.
All right, that's it for this week, kids. We will be back again next week with more brand new episodes of the Best in Paranormal Talk Radio. And remember, you can check me out Monday through Friday on the Best in Anomalous Talk Radio, Midnight in the Desert. You'll find information again, and you can subscribe at midnightinthedesert.com/hunger. And don't forget, the Best in True Crime Talk Radio just keeps getting better. Dave and Tim continue to explore strange and bizarre cases from all around the world and throughout history of just some of the most bizarre crimes and chilling criminals that we've ever heard about. We've also got dumb crimes and stupid criminals. So you can be terrified and cowering in a corner 1 minute thinking about the evils of humanity, and in the next laughing along with Tim and I. You can subscribe to True Crime Tuesday right now. Go to darknessradio.com. Click on the True Crime Tuesday banner and subscribe. $5 a month gets you 4 brand new episodes that are 90 to 120 minutes long. And we cover all the great topics you love to hear from some of the most amazing and impressive speakers worldwide. Go subscribe right now and get into the best in true crime talk radio. Now you've got the best of all worlds, the best of anomalous talk radio Monday through Friday with Midnight in the Desert, the best in paranormal talk radio Saturdays and Sundays with Beyond the Darkness, and the best in true crime talk radio every Tuesday with True Crime Tuesday. For Tim Dennis, I'm Dave Schrader. We'll be back again with you next week right here on Beyond the Darkness.